If two sections of the bank look absolutely identical, the same depth, the same overhanging brush, the same water clarity, how do you decide which one actually holds a feeding base? Most beginners assume it is just a guessing game, changing lures and hoping one of those identical spots produces a strike by pure luck. But the data shows that base positioning is entirely predictable, governed by microcurrents and the exact angle of the sun, meaning you might be throwing the right lure at the right structure, but from a completely useless trajectory. This video breaks down 10 specific adjustments you must make on the bank to fix these common mistakes. We are going to cover how a bass's lateral line dictates where they ambush prey, why your casting position matters more than your lure color, and what a follow that stops right at the shoreline is actually telling you about your next move. None of this requires expensive sonar equipment or a boat. The real cost of continuing to make these beginner mistakes is not just a missed strike on a single cast. It is the hours of time you spend meticulously working dead water, draining your confidence with every empty retrieve. It is the frustration of walking right past the most productive spot on the lake simply because you believed the fish were not eating today, when in reality, your approach was signaling danger before your lure ever hit the water. To fix this, we have to dismantle the fishing advice you have likely heard your whole life, starting with the most destructive myth in bank fishing. The first major mistake is the belief that you should walk right up to the water's edge before making your first cast. It sounds logical to get as close to the action as possible to maximize your casting distance. But fish biology proves this is actively costing you catches, specifically due to a phenomenon called Snell's window. Because of how light refracts through the water's surface, a base holding in shallow water has a compressed, cone-shaped view of the world above the surface. When you walk heavily to the very edge of the bank, your entire silhouette enters that window, casting a shadow and sending ground vibrations straight into the water. You're effectively announcing your presence to the most aggressive, actively feeding fish that push shallow to hunt. The test is simple. On your next spot, stop 10 feet back from the shoreline and make your first 3 casts parallel to the bank you're standing on. If you catch a fish from that distance, you know the shallow bite is active and you just saved a spot you would have otherwise destroyed by stepping on it. But standing back will not help if you're making the second mistake, which is always casting directly at the cover you want to fish. The common advice is to drop your bait right on top of the submerged tree or the weedline edge. However, largemouth bass are ambush predators that rely heavily on the element of surprise, and dropping a 1-ounce piece of lead directly on their heads triggers a flight response, not a feeding response. A bass's lateral line is a sensory organ running down its side, packed with neuromasts that detect minute water displacement and low-frequency vibrations. When baitfish approach, they create a rhythmic, approaching displacement that the bass tracks to calculate its strike. A lure crashing down from the sky right next to them creates a chaotic, unnatural shockwave. Instead, you must cast 10 feet past the structure and bring the lure into the strike zone naturally, allowing the bass to feel it coming before it enters their visual field. This brings us to the third myth, which is the idea that a constant, steady retrieve is the best way to cover water. Many beginners throw a spinnerbait or a crankbait and just wind it straight back to the rod tip, believing that the mechanical action of the lure will do all the work. But studies on predatory fish behavior show that a bass evaluates the vulnerability of its prey before expending the energy to chase it. A baitfish swimming in a perfect straight line at a constant speed signals a healthy, difficult target. A baitfish that erratically changes speed, deflecting off rocks or suddenly pausing, mimics injury and vulnerability. If you are just reeling straight in, now you're missing the most critical trigger in fishing, the pause. You should consciously kill the retrieve every few turns of the handle, letting the bait fall or suspend for a single second. If that pause does not generate a strike, the issue might not be your retrieve, but the fourth mistake, ignoring the direction of the wind. The common assumption is that a calm, glass-like surface is ideal for fishing because it makes casting easier and topwater bites more visible. In reality, wind is the engine of the food chain in any body of water. Wind creates surface currents that push microscopic phytoplankton against a specific bank. Baitfish follow that plankton, and the bass follow the baitfish, pinning them against that windward shoreline. Fishing the calm, protected side of the lake feels comfortable for the angler, but you're fishing in an acoustic and biological dead zone. The rule to test is to always fish the bank where the wind is blowing into your face, even if it makes casting more difficult. If you're fishing the windward bank and still not getting bit, it leads directly to the fifth myth, the belief that deep water is always better. Beginners often try to cast as far out into the middle of the lake as their equipment allows, assuming the biggest fish live in the deepest holes. But unless there is a specific topographic feature out there, deep open water is a biological desert for bass. Bass are edge-oriented creatures. They relate to transitions where two different environments meet. The edge of a weed line, the transition from gravel to mud, or the sharp drop-off of a ledge is where food is funneled and concentrated. Instead of casting perpendicular to the bank into the abyss, you need to cast at a 45-degree angle to the shoreline, keeping your lure in that transitional edge for the entire duration of the retrieve. This edge orientation directly connects to the sixth mistake, which involves how beginners read shade. The myth is that you should fish the sunny areas first because the water is warmer and the fish are more active. But bass lack eyelids, and their retinas take significantly longer to adjust to bright light than human eyes do. They actively use shade lines from trees, docks, or even steep banks as optical camouflage. They hold in the dark water where their pupils are dilated, looking out into the brightly lit water where prey is highly visible and silhouetted. If you cast your lure directly into the deepest part of the shade, it has already passed behind the fish's field of view. You must bring your lure parallel to the edge of the shade line, dragging it right through the window they are actively watching. But what happens when you do that, and the fish follows the bait all the way to your feet without biting? This exposes the seventh myth, the belief that a following fish is a sign you need to change your lure color. When a bass follows a bait and turns away at the last second, the beginner immediately opens the tackle box to look for a different shade of green or silver. But a follow means the color, profile, and vibration were correct enough to draw the fish out of its ambush spot. The reason it did not strike is that it ran out of runway, or it realized the prey was acting too unnatural as it approached the surface. Instead of changing the lure, change the speed or the angle of the retrieve on the very next cast. If you speed the bait up as it nears the bank, it triggers a predatory panic response, forcing the bass to either strike immediately or lose the meal. This predatory response leads to the eighth mistake, which is setting the hook the exact fraction of a second you see a surface strike. On topwater baits, the visual explosion of water creates a massive adrenaline spike in the angler, causing an immediate and violent hook set. But a bass feeding on the surface often uses the water displacement of its own mouth opening to suck the prey downward before clamping its jaws shut. When you swing the rod, the instant you see the splash, you are frequently pulling the lure right out of the fish's open mouth. The verifiable field test for this is simple. When you see a topwater strike, Force yourself to wait until you actually feel the physical weight of the fish on the rod before setting the hook. If you feel the weight, you drive the hook home. If you do not, you leave the bait exactly where it is, because a missed base will often strike a second time if the prey appears stunned. The ninth myth is the idea that changing lures constantly will eventually unlock a dead spot. Many bank anglers will stand in one location for 2 hours, rotating through every piece of plastic in their bag, convinced that the right color will magically turn the fish on. But if you have presented a fast-moving bait to check for aggressive fish and a slow-moving bottom bait to check for lethargic fish, and neither gets a bite, the problem is not your tackle. The problem is that the fish are simply not there, or they are in a completely dormant state due to environmental factors like a dropping barometer. The biological reality is that you cannot force a fish to eat if it is not in a feeding window and you are fishing empty water. You must limit yourself to 15 minutes per spot. If there is no sign of life, you have to pack up and walk to the next piece of structure. And that brings us to the 10th and final myth, which ties everything together: the belief that one single variable will guarantee a catch. Beginners want a magic bullet, a specific lure, a specific knot, a specific time of day that guarantees success. But everything we have covered so far, the wind pushing the bait, the shade line creating the ambush point, the angle of the cast, and the speed of the retrieve, assumes you are treating these factors separately. The truth is, bass in a feeding mode do not care about a single isolated variable. The same submerged tree you just learned to fish from a distance only becomes a high percentage spot when the wind is hitting it, the shade is extending off it, and your lure crosses the exact edge where those elements intersect. The structure itself is not the magic. The structure is just the canvas. The timing, the water movement, and the light penetration are what actually position the fish, which means the spot that was completely dead at 7 in the morning might be the most explosive spot on the lake by noon, simply because the sun shifted and the wind picked up. The fish did not migrate miles away. They just moved 10 feet to adjust to the new sensory data. If this changed how you read the water, there are more videos here that work the exact same way. No magic lures, no expensive gear, just practical ways to find and catch more fish. Subscribing makes sure you do not miss the next one. On your next trip, bring just one rod and one bait. Find 3 distinct edges on your local bank. Test the windward side first. Maintain your distance from the water and retrieve parallel to the shade line. That is the whole experiment, and it will teach you more than a tackle box full of new lures ever